Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to a closer look at Nepal. My name is Nico Lofsinger, and I'm the Executive Director here at Asia Society Switzerland. As you are probably aware, in our series, A Closer Look, we shed light on Asian countries through the eyes of leading local voices. I'm delighted I'm getting to moderate this, sitting in for my dear friend Noel Culhane of BDO, who unfortunately had a scheduling conflict. So I get to moderate one of these, which I haven't done in a while, and I'm very, very excited about. Today, we're looking at Nepal, the Himalayan nation that has experienced quite a few fundamental events over the past 25 years or so, and is now hoping to find a stable footing while being wedged between two major ever-growing giants, China and India. In the coming hour, we'll talk with two leading voices from Nepal, and in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so, we also want to address your questions on Nepal. You can submit questions whenever you want already now through the Q&A function on Zoom, which would be either at the bottom or the top of your screen. If you don't have a question yourself, you can still click on that and see what questions others have submitted, and you can even upvote specific questions that you like, and that will give me a signal that that's a question we should address with priority. So with that out of the way, let's begin with a couple of slides giving you a brief introduction of Nepal, the only country on the planet with a non-rectangular flag. That's a fun little thing to know about Nepal. So Nepal is about 3.5 times the size of Switzerland, and 75% of the country, as you're probably aware, lies in the Himalaya, the highest mountain chain on Earth, earning Nepal the apt nickname, the roof of the world. The highest point is, of course, Mount Everest, which sits at 8,848 meters, and is, I was not aware of this, growing by 5 millimeters a year. Nepal has a population of 30.6 million people, and it's growing at a bit over 2% a year. What's especially notable here is that 2.1 million Nepali work abroad, mostly in the Middle East, in Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea. The country has its own time zone, 4 hours and 45 minutes ahead of Switzerland, and even 15 minutes ahead of its southern neighbor, India. Nepal has a GDP per capita of around $1,200 US, which ranks it last in South Asia and 186th worldwide. Growth has been picking up fast, though, since borders reopened after the pandemic, and it's estimated to come in at around 5.8% over the current fiscal year. Remittances from the earlier mentioned large group of Nepali working primarily in the Middle East and Malaysia are responsible for up to 25% of Nepal's GDP. The number of young people looking to work abroad is still rising. In January this year alone, 40,000 of them obtained work permits for foreign employment. Another important sector for Nepal, of course, is tourism. And you'll see here the aforementioned Mount Everest on the picture. Tourism accounts for about 8% of the economy and provides work for about 1 million people. The industry suffered a complete shutdown during the pandemic. Once reopening started, China has begun to invest heavily in Nepal's tourism infrastructure, counting on a strong recovery of foreign tourists coming to Nepal. Over the past 7 years, China has been the largest foreign investor in the country, also pouring money into large-scale hydropower and transportation infrastructure, aiming to tie Nepal across the Himalaya to China. Still, India is by far the largest trading partner for Nepal at a total value of $6.5 billion US, of which almost everything, 5.9 billion, is imported from India. Just a very, very quick overview of Nepalese history. Since 1768, when the Gorkha Kingdom finished conquering neighboring territories and unified for the first time the area we know today as Nepal. In 1923, Nepal and Britain signed a treaty in which the UK recognizes Nepal as a fully independent state. The relations between Nepal and Britain had been good before the treaty, with 200,000 Nepali Gorkha soldiers fighting with the British in World War I. And for the UK, Nepal was always a good buffer to have between British India and China. In 1951, inspired by the independence movement in India, Nepal changed from an absolute monarchy to a parliamentary democracy. A decade of power struggle between the king and politicians follows, leading to the king taking back full control in 1960. Not until 1990 do political parties make a comeback after massive protest against absolute rule. In 1996, The Maoist communists of Nepal start their violent guerrilla attacks to get rid of the king altogether and establish the People's Republic. The 10-year-long fight leaves 16,000 dead, including the king and the crown prince, and 7 other members of the royal family were murdered at the palace in 2001. The violence finally ends in 2006 with the king stripped of his powers. 2 years later, Nepal votes to abolish the monarchy altogether and to become a secular federal democracy, ending the last Hindu kingdom that still existed. Things have remained difficult since, though, not least because of the devastating earthquake in 2015 that killed 9,000 people, flattening many villages and leaving hundreds of thousands of people homeless. Now, it's my great pleasure to talk about Nepal, to welcome, for now, not 2, but at least 1 local leader, Suman Joshi, who is widely regarded as one of the most innovative banking experts in Nepal. He's currently dedicated to improving the ecosystem for alternative investments in Nepal. Following a successful banking career, he established True North Associates, which is now a prominent domestic private capital vehicle. In 2018, TNA acquired a significant stake in Dutch impact investment firm One to Watch, which channels foreign capital into Nepali SMEs. With financial support from the Swiss Development Corporation and FMO, the Development Bank of the Netherlands, True North and One to Watch established a COVID fund for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in Nepal. And Suman, if you could turn back on your camera and microphone, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Namaste.
Namaste. I was remiss to mention to everybody joining the call that I actually have a cup of Nepalese butter tea that was kindly made for me by the team here. So I almost feel like I'm in Kathmandu, which of course is where Suman is. Let me just point out before we jump into the conversation that we expected to be joined as well by Indira on this call. She's delayed. We are tracking her down, but there's no reason to not get started. Suman, obviously being very knowledgeable about all things Nepal, so I suggest we just jump in, and Indira will join us whenever she can. With that, Suman, let me start with something that we've hit on briefly, we mentioned before, which is the earthquake back in 2015. And of course, we've all seen the devastating images just from a few weeks ago of the earthquake hitting Turkey and Syria. The earthquake in Nepal in 2015 was of a similar magnitude, 7.8 on the Richter scala, and killed close to 9,000 people, wiping out complete villages and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless, destroying century-old buildings and World Heritage sites. It's been estimated that the quake wiped out an entire third of Nepali GDP. Then of course I would imagine that while recovery was still ongoing, we've had a pandemic that has lasted for almost 3 years. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the rebuilding efforts, how both the physical rebuilding as well as the broader rebuilding as the economy has been going since 2015, and what effects the pandemic has had on this in the last 3 years?
Nico, obviously the earthquake was an overwhelming experience. All of us felt really small in front of the forces of the nature. We were helpless, and hundreds of aftershocks didn't help our cause. So there was a prolonged period of uncertainty and fear and helplessness. But there was a lot of support from the international community to help us get back on track, and also the Nepali diaspora. There was an excellent show of volunteerism, both locally as well as from the international community. People from all corners of the world literally poured into Nepal and tried to help us. Lives were disrupted, of course, but all those activities did help us track back. But the thing is, our pain from the earthquake had to give way for a further catastrophe we faced a few months later. That was in the form of the trade and transit impasse with India. So goods were not moving through the Indian border, and then there was another crisis to be sort of faced, right? In a span of about 6-7 months, we went from one crisis to another. So with the help of the international community, I think we have done a decent job of getting back on feet in fairly quick time. The estimated damage, according to the Nepal, the National Planning Commission, I believe was about $7 billion. And I remember an international donor conference that happened in Kathmandu right after the earthquake, while the aftershocks were still being experienced. It was held under a tent, and a lot of donors poured in. And in one day, there was a commitment of $4 billion. And more must have trickled in later. I don't know how much of that we were able to draw from, but that kind of support kind of helped us start the rebuilding process. Of course, there were initial glitches in terms of the delays in setting up the National Reconstruction Authority. But once we sorted those out, rebuilding, I would say, happened reasonably quickly. I understand about 700,000 households, they were able to tap into this support and build their houses back. Hospitals and schools have mostly been built back, rebuilt. And the monuments, it was a very sad sight in heritage areas. You go, you don't see the monuments anymore, but then those monuments are slowly coming back. Many of them have been rebuilt. It's really nice to see them come back, and you have that old feeling back again. So I would say the rebuilding process has by and large been decent. Just to give you a flavor of how we recovered economically, back in 2015, I think our GDP was about $25 billion. Today, it's close to $40 billion. So in a span of 8 years, we have grown a bit. This is in spite of the pandemic that we had in between. So from one broad measure, you could say that we haven't done that bad.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this overview. Now I want to ask, seeing as this is an event by Asia Society Switzerland, and obviously I'm here in Switzerland, and certainly some of the people listening and watching today are as well. You mentioned the big support of the international community for Nepal in the aftermath of the earthquake, and I'm aware that Switzerland was part of this community. And you said before, when we were preparing for this conversation, that there was a very strong Swiss-Nepal connection, and in a way, maybe we felt that there were even some similarities between the countries. And of course, you yourself, through your work, are connected to Switzerland as well. So talk a little bit from your perspective, if you can, about the Swiss-Nepal connection and relationship, and why you feel it's particularly strong, or whether you feel it is particularly strong. That might not be the case.
Well, first of all, there are certain similarities between Nepal and Switzerland. We're both mountainous countries, and we're both landlocked countries, small countries in terms of size. But obviously, we are at two ends of the spectrum in terms of economic prosperity, of course. But at the people-to-people level, there is a strong connection historically. I remember a Swiss, when we were little, the Swiss parties supporting our cheese industry. And I also remember a mid-hill highway that the Swiss helped us build back in, I think, the 60s. So it goes all the way back. And more recently, over the last 10, 15 years, I know that the embassy is trying to help us in many ways on the economic front, as well as helping Nepal set up its federal structure, whatever support it needs in terms of local governance. It's been trying to look at that as well. There's one province out of 7 which the Swiss have kind of adopted to help structurally and with capacity building activities. So yeah, I mean, we Nepalis by and large have a very healthy respect for the Swiss support, and we have a lot of warmth towards the Swiss people in general.
Now, you mentioned the mountainous terrain as one similarity, and that is obviously very true. I think another sort of geographical similarity that we could point out is that both Switzerland and Nepal are surrounded by countries that are much bigger than them. I could argue that here in Switzerland, this fact and kind of like the mountainous part of the country have led to a certain kind of like culture of independence, or one could also say isolationism. And I'm curious, does this exist in Nepal as well? Is there a sense, of sort of being also a little bit sort of in the middle of things, but also having a very strong sense of wanting to be and remain independent and not sort of, not be too entangled with any of the larger powers around you?
Well, I'll say 2 things. First of all, Nepal has never been colonized. We've always been an independent country, of course. Secondly, there could be a perception that Nepal is so wedged between these 2 large countries that it's almost isolated. But the fact is, we're not an isolated country. We're fairly open. We have relationships with most countries in the world. Our people travel all over the world, and we have people coming from all over the world. There's a lot of interaction at the people-to-people level. The fact that we have been landlocked has cost us in many ways economically more than anything else. We have an open border with India, more than 1,800 kilometers long. So culturally, we are more connected with the Indian people because you'll notice that in the north, there's Himalayas, which separates us from China. So the people-to-people contact hasn't been that robust as it is with people from India. But nonetheless, we have historically tried to maintain good relationships with both the countries. Of course, there are challenges at times, but we have benefited from the support that our 2 big neighbors have accorded to us. Support in terms of infrastructure building and a lot. So, I mean, just to allay your, apprehension about whether Nepal is an isolated country, it absolutely is not.
Yeah. Let me turn briefly to the political landscape. Now, I should preface this by saying that we had been preparing for and hoping that Indira, was the deputy speaker of the Nepali House of Representatives, is here, who of course could have shared some insights. And you said in preparation that maybe politics is not sort of the area that you feel most comfortable commenting on. So I would just ask you not to go too deeply, but maybe to give us a little bit of a very broad overview, just of kind of basically of the facts and what has happened in Nepali politics in the last few months, because it's been eventful, to say the least. And some people, and certainly myself, have sometimes a little bit of a hard time tracking and keeping up with what's going on. So for context, there's been elections in November last year for the House of Representatives, and there's a new prime minister who's come in a few weeks after those elections. Can you give us again like a very brief overview of sort of the events that sort of led up sort of the new coalition taking over?
Well, let me try to quickly give you a context first. Over the last 30 years, we've had about 30 governments. So that gives you a sense of how unstable our politics has been, right? So fast forward to last 3 months, there was a lot of hope amongst the people that this time around we would be able to elect new faces, somebody who would perform for real, as opposed to what has been happening over the last 30 years. So people went to vote, and the results came in. We did see a few new faces, but I'm afraid the new faces which people believe are capable to deliver don't have a critical mass yet. So we ended up, having a same scenario where the same 4 or 5 people would compete to become the prime minister, right? So no party achieved absolute majority, so they had to form a coalition. One coalition was formed to enable the current prime minister to take office, but then a couple of months into the job, the main supporting party withdrew their support, and we're kind of back to square one. He's trying to cobble up a different coalition, and there's a president's election happening as we speak today. There was a voting, and the result is expected to be announced by tonight. And following that, we expect the political scenario in terms of who will be in the government and who all will support the prime minister, whoever the prime minister is. If the current one continues, he will be. If somebody else comes, we will wait and see who becomes the prime minister. So that really is what the man on the street has been grappling with for past several decades, and people like us who come from the private sector have kind of learned to build that into our equation. We take it in our stride, and we try to do our things in spite of the political instability. Of course, there are challenges when you try to do that, but we've just the life just goes on.
Thank you very much. I think this is helpful. You already mentioned that we had on one hand these sort of kind of like shifting coalitions from within the established political parties, but there's also just a lot of new faces that came in, were elected. A lot of sense, it seems, among the electorate of sort of being fed up a little bit with sort of the kind of the usual politicians and a wish towards having outside forces come in, and perhaps the most prominent of these outside faces that came in, and certainly someone that's been sort of popular to track here at the Asia Society Switzerland office is the newly elected mayor of Kathmandu, Balan Shah, who before becoming a mayor was a quite successful and famous rapper, and as well as a structural engineer in Nepal. Now, again, early days. He's only been on the job for a little bit, but can you already say something specifically on sort of how these kind of newly elected outside forces are sort of fitting into the political system? Is there, is the change and maybe just the energy and the pace that I assume voters have hoped for when sort of making those choices, is that materializing already, or is it too early to make any judgment on that?
Like I said earlier, people hope to elect more new faces, more clean faces, people who they believe would be able to deliver. But like I said, the number is not large enough. We don't believe that there's a critical mass. So in spite of their best efforts, some of them are doing great work already. The other guest that was supposed to be on the webinar today is also represents that group. But the thing is, because they are so small in number, it's quite unlikely that they will be able to, bring the change that people expect. But it's a start, and hopefully the next election will have more such people, and we will turn the corner. Coming back to the Kathmandu mayor, he's been on the job for a little less than a year, I think. And my guess is that people's reaction to whatever he has said and done is kind of mixed. People do believe that his intent is positive, but probably, there are people who have a different opinion about the method he has adopted in pursuing the changes that he wants to bring about. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a little too early, but as of now, the signal is mixed from my perspective.
Excellent. Let's turn kind of back. We've already discussed a little bit the economy at the outset when you talked about the recovery from the earthquake, but I want to go a little bit deeper here, and let me start by quoting or reading two quotes from two different people, which I think sort of go in very opposite directions, and then we can sort of see sort of where you land on that spectrum. So the first quote is from an economics professor at Kathmandu University, Achyut Wagle, and he said, and I quote, "Nepal's key economic indicators unequivocally show that the economy is in a risky zone. Near zero production and export, as well as reliance on imports. The country's economy requires major structural adjustments," end quote. And I'm going to sort of counterpose that with a quote from an investment manager, actually at your company, True North Associates, Nitan Shrestha, who said in an interview with an online publication that Nepal was at the dawn of becoming a tech hub in South Asia, with an inspiring and growing Nepali diaspora, globally now bringing home business acumen, innovation, and success stories. Nepal is reconnecting to the globe and poised for exponential growth again here, end quote. Now, no one's saying that not both of these things can be true at the same time, but still it seems like the sentiment in the first quote is dramatically more negative than in the second quote. So I'd be curious to hear, sort of where you come down on this, and sort of this span of major structural adjustments that are needed versus a lot of energy and a lot of activity also happening on the ground.
Well, what Dr. Achyut Wagle said about the country still being in a risky zone is true. That's a reflection of the external challenges that many countries in the world are facing. COVID, Ukraine, inflation, all those aspects. Some countries have coped better than others. In the South Asia region, we seem to have done better than a few other countries, but we're certainly not out of the woods yet. And so in that respect, we're still in the risky zone. We need to do more, but we're perhaps not as vulnerable as some of the other countries in South Asia. So that's for the short term. But I think Nidan's comment on the potential for IT business out of Nepal is also true, given the fact that IT is something that we don't need to rely on the external forces. We now have the manpower, the skilled manpower. We have thousands of IT graduates churning out of IT schools in Nepal. Our diaspora is, beginning to make inroads into senior appointments, senior positions in large tech businesses in the West. And many of them are turning entrepreneurial as well, and trying to look back to their home country to source some of the work for their own companies. Nepal will be a cost-effective destination for IT skills from that perspective, of course. And IT is an area which is quite easily exportable, scalable, and it doesn't need to be confined to the boundaries of Nepal. So from that perspective, we are now at a point where we're quite excited about the potential that IT can bring. I mean, there was a point in time back in early 2000s when we had taken small steps alongside India's Silicon Valley called Bangalore as well. We had set up a number of call centers, and we were already beginning to cater to the Western clients back then. But the difference now is that our infrastructure is much better. The power situation is much more stable. The internet connectivity is much better. So these are the two, key ingredients that you need, and then the skills. We have all these, and then the connection through the diaspora, plus the fact that there is access to a lot of information and knowledge, thanks, of course, to the internet and social media. We are in a position to produce a lot in the IT space.
One of the a company that actually your company at True North Resources acquired, One2Watch, a Dutch company originally, is working on bringing foreign capital into Nepali SMEs. So I was curious to hear a little bit from that experience that you have. What kind of SMEs in Nepal, are in your experience most attractive to foreign capital? What kind of capital is this? Where does it come from? Are there any trends that you observe? So what is the we've seen a bit the macro picture. I'm curious to hear maybe a few examples of Nepali SMEs that have successfully attracted foreign capital and put it to work.
Nepal has a decent set of policies to attract FDIs. The only challenge we have is in terms of execution, of course. Most sectors are open. There is a negative list, but it's kind of short. Most sectors are open. The businesses that we have managed to invest in by raising capital in the European countries include different kinds of businesses, IT being one, a number of agri-businesses. For example, we've invested in a coffee company. We've invested in a ginger exporting company. We've invested in solar. There's a, irrigation company. So the range is quite large. Foreigners are not allowed to invest in retail, agriculture, and media. Most of the sectors are open. So our experience has been that there's a lot of interest to look at Nepal, despite the difficult nuances of doing business here. Of course, the conventional commercial capital may not be interested given the attractive propositions that they have elsewhere, but entities like development financial institutions and Friends of Nepal, they're certainly keen to explore investment opportunities and help Nepali businesses gain scale. So we're now at a point where the development financial institutions are taking a lot of interest. There's a big group of TFIs traveling into the country as we speak. I think it's next week. They will be interacting with a lot of businesses. These sort of interactions are growing in terms of frequency and intensity as well. And we expect a lot more FDI to flow in the months and years to come.
Thank you. I want to ask you one last question before we turn it to audience questions. So just a quick reminder to the people listening in that if you do have a question for Suman, you can post it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There are actually quite a few questions that have been submitted already, so I urge you, even if you don't specifically have one yourself, to take a quick look and maybe give an upvote to one of those or two of those questions that you would like to see most answered, and then we can address those. But before we get there, Suman, I want to come back to something that we talked about at the very beginning, which is this the geographical location of Nepal wedged between two large powers, if not to say two superpowers, India and China. And the notable fact that I found very interesting when preparing is that India is Nepal's largest trade partner, as we've noted, but China is Nepal's largest source of foreign investment. So does that mean that there's almost a competition of equals going on for vying for economic influence in Nepal, or can we not compare those two metrics directly?
Well, let's put it this way. You're right on both counts. India is our largest trading partner, and China is our largest foreign investor. But if you consider the total amount of foreign investment that comes in, it's still very small. So in that context, despite China being the largest, the amount being invested is not significant enough. Whereas, like I alluded to earlier, with India, because of the large open border, our interaction is much deeper and much wider. So, yeah, I think we need to understand it in that perspective. Of course, both the countries have been supporting Nepal in terms of building its infrastructure. Those are not always funded by the respective countries. Of course, they do support us financially as well, but then many of those are funded through other sources as well. So, yeah, I mean, both the countries are quite active in helping Nepal grow economically, to say the least.
Let me just very quickly, I think this is an important qualification that you make, right? So that the India-Nepal relationship, of course, in many ways runs much deeper. There's much more integration between those two countries. And you said something very interesting right back at the beginning when we were talking about the earthquake again, is that, so there was a few months after the earthquake, this additional crisis when suddenly that border, which is usually open and important for trade, was suddenly closed. So is there also a sense, and is there a sense of conversation in Nepal about being too dependent on India, about being sort of being sort of too reliant on the goodwill and support of your southern neighbor?
Yeah, there's plenty of chatter and tea shop conversations like that. But the reality is that, by virtue of the way the geography is shaped, we would be vulnerable to that, right? We've had in the recent past at least two occasions of border disruptions from our southern neighbor, and not many people know this, but even China did not open their border after the earthquake for quite a while. So they had their reasons, and people like us, we sort of take that in our stride. Like I said, do not for the man on the street, it's doesn't make too much of a difference to us in the sense that, well, we do experience the hardship, of course, because if the borders are closed, we experience shortages and all that. But what can we do? We are a impoverished, not so strong country, and all we can do is try and navigate the geopolitical competition between India and China to maintain our sovereignty and protect our national interests. And to that, I will say our politicians have done a reasonably good job.
Excellent. Let me turn to audience questions now, of which we have quite a few. So I'll try to address as many as we can. And we'll start with one that I think is a good follow-up to the conversation we just had about the Nepal-India relationship. It's been pointed out to me several times, and one of the questions says this here as well, that the region of South Asia, which comprises India and Sri Lanka and Pakistan and of course Nepal, Bangladesh, and a few other countries, is among the least integrated in terms of trade and economy in the world. I think that's pretty much an undisputed fact. From a Nepali point of view, where do you see opportunities, and how would you assess the chances of a deeper economic integration across the South Asian region, not just with India, but with some of these other countries as well. India, of course, being by far the largest one. But it seems that given the way the region and the economies of the respective countries are structured, there would be quite a lot to gain from a deeper integration. Regional free trade agreements or something similar. Is that something that is on the horizon? And is that something that would be even beneficial to Nepal?
Well, I would suspect that the size of the countries that comprise South Asia in terms of, let's say, GDP, India's GDP is approaching 4 trillion, right? Nepal is 40 billion. Bangladesh, now the second largest, has about 460, 70 billion. So the difference in size makes India a dominant force, of course. And unless India wants the integration, unless they see the integration working in their favor, the smaller countries can do little about making it happen, right? That's a fact of life. So I guess that's a good topic for discussion, but then it really depends on India as to how they want to pursue this. As for Nepal's own strengths, I would say this. We have identified a number of areas where we have comparative advantages, hydropower being one, tourism being one, and maybe agriculture to a large extent. Although in terms of agriculture, we have messed up a bit and we haven't realized our potential at all. Tourism, we can do a lot more. Hydro, we're beginning to show some good results. Even there, we are kind of dependent on India to buy the surplus power that we generate. Here again, it's worthwhile to mention that while India is keen to consume Nepal's power, the geopolitical competition comes into play here as well, as they appear to be less keen to buy hydropower generated by plants that have been supported by China. So these are some of the nuances that come into play, and we can only try and balance things out. The fourth emerging space of competitive advantage that I alluded to again is IT. So if we look at these four sectors, tourism, agriculture, hydro, and IT, and try to address the challenges around this, I think we can make more rapid progress. Like I said, on the political front, with the new faces slowly making the numbers, we hope to have put the political instability issues behind us in the years to come. And our focus will hopefully be stronger on economic prosperity, which hasn't been the case, unfortunately, for the last 30 years. Like I said, 30 governments in 30 years, they hardly have time to even articulate what our economic vision is. So we're at a juncture where we believe we're feeling really good about our prospects, and we believe that we'll begin to sort of make progress. Incidentally, post-COVID, tourism has actually bounced back. We see a lot of tourists coming back. There's a lot of business travelers as well. And one significant development, positive development that we've experienced is also increase in domestic tourism. A lot of people are traveling internally as well. So all these things, and there's a lot of investment going into tourism infrastructure, mainly hotel rooms and uh, uh, items like cable cars, and so these are hopefully factors that will sort of improve our tourism performance in the short term.
Yeah, let me because you've partially answered this already, but this was an audience question, and I wanted to follow up on this anyway. You said tourism obviously is one of the four sectors where where there are opportunities, but progress needs to be made. So where do you see the need for action on the tourism side? There's been, I think the one thing that we hear a lot here when it comes to Nepali tourism is, of course, Mount Everest, which makes the country very attractive as a destination, but also there are a lot of conversation about how sustainable that is and how scaling it up and allowing even more people in, allowing more people up into the mountains would have quite adverse effects on the ecosystem, but maybe even in the country as a whole. So where do you see the need for investment and for action in the tourism sector? Is there a role the government can play? But also, where do you see potential risks? As the tourism sector might accelerate almost too much?
I mentioned the private sector enthusiasm on the tourism sector. That needs to be matched by improvement in infrastructure. And I believe only the government can do that, right? The real bottleneck has been the inadequate infrastructure that we have here. We could do much more, obviously. The other challenge perhaps is the quality of public service delivery, the experience that the visitors have to go through as soon as they enter the airport terminal. So all those things need to improve for the better. So if we can take care of infrastructure and public service delivery, it's about adding destinations and activities and stuff. Those, I believe, will follow through with increase in number of visitors as well. What we also need to sort of try and achieve is not only the number of visitors coming in, but also the quality of visitors in terms of the amount that they spend. You may achieve a good growth in terms of number of visitors, but if you only attract low spenders, you're not really growing your tourism. So we need to develop destinations and activities that will attract that class of tourists too. And I think you're alluding to potential downside in the form of ecosystem. Yes, that challenge is there. There's growing awareness, but obviously we will need a lot of intervention from institutions, private and the government and the international to be able to handle that. But I would say that that's a happy problem. That'll be a happy problem to have, because if we have more tourists, then we will have more resources to be paying attention to these downside items as well.
Mm-hmm. Because you mentioned hydropower as well, is there a trade-off between developing the hydropower sector and tourism, in the sense of that developing hydropower obviously would require maybe developing some areas that are still very natural, very pristine? Is that a discussion, or are those two? Is it possible to basically do both things sort of concurrently?
Well, as of now, we haven't. We don't believe that is an issue. Hydropower plants tend to be in the river basins, usually away from large settlements, not necessarily in the trek routes or the tourist destinations. So we haven't. We don't believe that's a major issue as of now.
Okay. Let me just continue. We're already nearing the end of our time, but there are a few questions I still want to get in. if I may. So we've received a few different questions. I'm going to try to kind of like wrap it all into one, if I can, about the relationship between Nepal and Tibet, which of course is the Chinese province that Nepal is bordering towards, and which also has a government in exile. What is your sense? How is the Nepali-Tibetan relationship sort of like playing into the Nepal-China relationship, if at all?
Well, I don't have much comment to offer here because there is very little available out in the open. I do realize that the Tibet issue is an irritant to the Chinese government. We do hear and read the news around that, and the government has been trying to manage that issue as well. But at the people-to-people level, we have a lot of people of Tibetan origin mingling nicely with Nepali people in the valley as well as up in the mountains. So it's more of a political issue, more of a irritant for China than for us. And I guess we're trying to manage it the best way we can.
All right. Last question from the audience. Questions going into a completely different direction, but it was popular, and I actually think it's a nice question to ask. The question is, what is currently popular in Nepal among the younger generation? What kind of music is popular? What kind of like cultural traditions do they have, or are they developing? Is there something kind of uniquely Nepalese in terms of what's popular, or is it sort of maybe fitting in more into the broader trends that we see across the region?
Uniquely Nepalese, I can't think of much, but like everywhere else in the world, TikTok is very popular. We have rappers, quite original. Some of those. You mentioned the mayor, who is a rapper as well. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the usual popular activities that our young people engage in. And I also mentioned the young people being IT savvy, so they are quite active on the social media. They do interact a lot through social media. There are some creative stuff out there too. But yeah, I guess I can't think of anything uniquely Nepali that's emerging.
All right. Thank you. Actually, if I may, we do have I think time maybe for one more question from the audience. Well, you've been very gracious, Suman, to kind of answer this very broad range of questions. You were supposed to be backed up by somebody else, and you had to do it all by yourself. So we appreciate that. Well, I'll give you one last question from the audience to consider, and then we can slowly wrap it up. And the question, which kind of like ties back to the Switzerland Nepal Development Corporation. So this is from somebody who has spoken to someone who's working in this field and said, that one issue that is maybe causing some worries on the Swiss side when looking at development cooperation is corruption. In Nepal, we haven't really touched on that, so I just wanted to brief it in and see, to which extent is this, not just when we look at development cooperation, but also in other things. To which extent is do you feel is corruption still a problem? Is it something that has been addressed over the last years? Has it been getting better, or is it on the opposite side maybe even gotten worse?
Well, I didn't want to pronounce the C word, but you brought it on. I was looking at World Bank data, which kind of indicated that Nepal is apparently the worst governed country in South Asia, sitting just above Afghanistan. So they have something called Government Effectiveness Index, mm-hmm. and Nepal is right at the bottom if you exclude Afghanistan. So a big reason for that is obviously the aspect that you just mentioned, which also has contributed to the political instability for far too long, right? But at the same time, let's also not take away some of the real progress Nepal has made in terms of social development. We are a much more open and much more liberal society today than we were 20, 25 years ago. Our people are now much more capable, much more exposed. They are capable of being more productive if given a chance. And we do have, new faces, cleaner politicians entering the fray. And we can only be optimistic about us turning the corner in the next few years. Hopefully, we'll have a better picture after the next election.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Suman. That was very insightful. And again, I do appreciate you sort of taking on questions from a very broad range of topics, as we unfortunately couldn't have Indira join us today. This was the second to last episode of A Closer Look this season. The very last one will be on Thailand 2 weeks from now. And Suman, we traditionally ask our guests whether they would have one thing that interests them most or one question they would like us to ask during the Thailand episode. So is there something related to Thailand that you've always wanted to ask?
Yeah, Thailand is a popular destination for Nepali travelers, and we are actually impressed by the progress they've made on the tourism sector. It's exemplary, and there's a lot we can learn from them. So, it'll be around that area if we were to ask for their support and help in terms of building our capacity. What else can we do to grow our own tourism sector?
I think that's such a good question. And now I really want to know what the answer to this is, and what Nepal, but possibly also other countries in Asia and beyond can learn from how Thailand has managed its tourism sector, which I agree with you. I think seems like a success story. Fantastic, Suman Joshi. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us, for taking on all those questions across such a broad range. It's been a pleasure and a delight, and it seems like you're doing a lot of really good and important work in Nepal, and I wish you all the success with that. We do hope that we may welcome you at some point here live in Switzerland, and of course look forward to seeing you at another occasion. And thank you everybody for joining us for this episode of A Closer Look on Nepal today. As I mentioned, the next and also last episode of A Closer Look for this season will be 2 weeks from now, also on a Thursday over lunch on Thailand. If you have not registered yet, please do so by going to our website, asiasociety.org/Switzerland. You click on the event, and you can sign up for it exactly as you did for today's event. And we'll hope many of you join us for that to learn, among many other things, the secrets to the success of Thailand's tourism industry and what we can all learn from it. With that, thank you very much to Suman in Kathmandu. Thank you to everybody, wherever you may be, for joining us today. And I do look forward to seeing you very soon.